The afternoon sun beat down on Pine Street as people went about their usual business, walking in and out of Harper's grocery with their shopping bags. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery next door, and children's laughter could be heard from the small park across the street. It was a normal Tuesday in September, the kind where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Mrs. Rose Wilson, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher, walked slowly but purposefully toward the grocery store entrance. Her gray hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and she wore a floral print dress with a light cardigan. In her hand, she carried her favorite woven shopping basket, the same one she'd been using for the past 20 years. She had taught at Lincoln Elementary for over 3 decades, shaping young minds and touching countless lives in the community. Just minutes earlier, a robbery had been reported a few blocks away. The suspect description was vague. Elderly person wearing light-colored clothing. Officer James Morrison, who had been patrolling nearby, spotted Mrs. Wilson and made a snap judgment. He'd been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 12 years, and during that time, he'd developed a reputation for being aggressive first and asking questions later. Morrison slammed his patrol car to a stop near the store entrance, tires screeching against the pavement. The sudden noise made Mrs. Wilson turn around, her hand clutching her chest in surprise. The officer jumped out, his face already red with predetermined anger. "Don't move. Put your hands where I can see them," Morrison shouted, his voice echoing off the building's brick walls. His hand was already resting on his weapon, despite Mrs. Wilson's obvious confusion and non-threatening demeanor. Several shoppers stopped in their tracks. A young mother quickly pulled her child behind her. Someone started recording with their phone. "Officer, I don't understand," Mrs. Wilson said calmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm just here to buy groceries." She slowly raised her hands, still holding her empty shopping basket. Her years of experience dealing with difficult situations in the classroom had taught her to remain composed. Morrison stormed toward her, his boots heavy against the concrete. "I said don't move," he barked, now just feet away from her. The veins in his neck were visible, his face contorted with unwarranted rage. "Sir, I'm Mrs. Wilson. I taught at Lincoln Elementary for 35 years. You can call the school," she began, but Morrison cut her off. "Shut up. You match the description of a robbery suspect," he snarled, now close enough that Mrs. Wilson could feel his angry breath on her face. A small crowd had gathered. Someone whispered, "That's Mrs. Wilson. She taught my kids." Another voice said, "Someone needs to call the station. This isn't right." Mrs. Wilson tried one more time to reason with the officer. "Please, officer, check my ID. I have it right here in my purse. I'm just a retired teacher." That's when it happened. As Mrs. Wilson slightly moved her hand toward her purse, Morrison snapped. His fist connected with the side of her face, sending her fragile frame sprawling onto the hard concrete. Her shopping basket clattered across the sidewalk, and her glasses skidded away, one lens cracking against the ground. The crowd gasped collectively. Phones were recording everywhere now. Someone screamed, "Oh my God." A store employee rushed outside, phone already to his ear, calling 911 to report an officer. Mrs. Wilson lay on the ground, her hand touching her swelling cheek in disbelief. Despite the pain, she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked up at Morrison with eyes full of disappointment, the same look she used to give troublesome students who had let her down. The reality of what he'd done started to sink in as Morrison looked around at the sea of shocked faces and recording phones. Every camera was pointed at him. Every expression showed horror and disgust. He'd just assaulted an elderly woman in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses. Then someone in the crowd called out, "That's District Attorney Wilson's mother." The color drained from Morrison's face. His hands began to shake as he realized who he'd just attacked. Mrs. Wilson wasn't just any retired teacher, she was the mother of the city's newly appointed district attorney, a man known for his tough stance on police misconduct. More police sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder. Store employees had brought out a chair and were helping Mrs. Wilson sit up. Despite her injury, she maintained her dignity, thanking them quietly for their help. A young nurse who happened to be shopping offered to check her vitals. Morrison stood frozen, his mind racing. In just a few minutes, he had not only violated his oath to protect and serve, but had also attacked one of the community's most respected elderly citizens. The gravity of his actions began to crush him like a weight. The crowd had grown larger now, with people spilling out of nearby shops and offices. Phones were already uploading videos to social media. Someone had called the local news station. Within minutes, the first reporter arrived, her cameraman capturing footage of Mrs. Wilson being tended to by concerned citizens, while Morrison stood by, looking increasingly pale and panicked. A senior officer arrived on the scene, quickly assessing the situation. One look at Mrs. Wilson's bruised face, the dozens of witnesses, and Morrison's guilty stance told him everything he needed to know. He immediately called for backup and medical assistance. "Officer Morrison," the senior officer said firmly, "step away and hand over your badge and gun." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. Everyone watched as Morrison, his hands trembling, slowly unclipped his badge and removed his weapon. Mrs. Wilson, still sitting in the chair provided by the store, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the hushed crowd. "I forgive you, Officer Morrison, but I pray you learn from this moment. Our community deserves better." Her words hit Morrison harder than any punch could have. Here was a woman he had just brutally assaulted, responding with grace and wisdom rather than anger. The shame he felt was overwhelming. As paramedics arrived to check on Mrs. Wilson, news of the incident was already spreading across social media. The first video had gone viral, and more were being uploaded every minute. Local news stations were breaking into regular programming to report on the assault. The crowd continued to grow, but it wasn't an angry mob. Instead, person after person stepped forward to help Mrs. Wilson or to give statements to the arriving investigators. Former students, parents, and community members all had stories to share about the positive impact she'd had on their lives. Morrison watched as his career and reputation crumbled around him, all because of a few seconds of uncontrolled rage and prejudice. He hadn't bothered to verify his suspect. He hadn't attempted to de-escalate. He hadn't shown basic human decency to an elderly woman. And now, as he stood there watching the community rally around Mrs. Wilson, he realized this was just the beginning of a storm that would change not only his life, but the entire police department. The sun was still shining on Pine Street, but nothing would ever be the same. In those few brutal moments, Officer Morrison had not only attacked an innocent elderly woman, he had shattered the community's trust and exposed a deep-rooted problem that could no longer be ignored. The first part of this story would become headline news across the country, sparking conversations about police reform, racial bias, and the treatment of elderly citizens. But for now, as Mrs. Wilson was carefully helped into an ambulance and Morrison was led away by his superior officers, the gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. This was more than just an incident, it was a turning point. Within hours of the incident at Harper's Grocery, the videos spread like wildfire across social media. People weren't just sharing them. They were adding their own stories about Mrs. Wilson, about previous run-ins with Officer Morrison, and about similar incidents that had gone unreported. The city was waking up to a reality that could no longer be ignored. Inside the emergency room at City General Hospital, Mrs. Wilson sat calmly as doctors examined her injuries. The bruising on her face had darkened, and small cuts from her broken glasses needed cleaning. Yet she maintained her composure, thanking each nurse and doctor who attended to her. One nurse recognized her immediately. Mrs. Wilson had taught her daughter years ago. "You know," Mrs. Wilson said softly to the nurse as she cleaned the cuts, "I keep thinking about all the young people I taught over the years. I always told them to stand up for what's right, but to do it with dignity. I guess now I have to live by those words more than ever." Meanwhile, at the police station, chaos erupted as news networks parked their vans outside, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky like maple trees. Inside, Officer Morrison sat in a small room, his head in his hands. The police chief, a veteran of 30 years, paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at his phone as messages poured in from city officials, community leaders, and the mayor's office. "What were you thinking?" The chief finally exploded, his voice bouncing off the bare walls. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to Mrs. Wilson, not just to yourself, but to this entire department." Morrison couldn't answer. The reality of his actions was crushing him. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. News outlets wanting comments, fellow officers expressing their disgust, and one message that made his blood run cold. A text from his mother saying she'd seen the video. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather. But this wasn't your typical angry mob. Former students of Mrs. Wilson stood shoulder to shoulder with community leaders. They held signs that read "Justice for Mrs. Wilson" and "Reform, not Revenge." The crowd grew larger as the evening news broadcast the story across every local channel. One of Mrs. Wilson's former students, now a community organizer, stood on the steps of the police station with a megaphone. "Mrs. Wilson taught us about dignity," she called out. "She taught us about respect. And today, she showed us both, even in the face of brutality. Now it's our turn to stand up for her." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the streets. News cameras captured every moment, broadcasting live as more people joined the gathering. The story was picking up momentum nationally. Social media couldn't get enough of the video showing a respected teacher being assaulted, followed by her graceful response. Back at the hospital, Mrs. Wilson's son, the district attorney, arrived. His face was tight with controlled anger as he hugged his mother carefully, mindful of her injuries. "Mom," he whispered, "you don't have to be strong right now. It's okay to be angry." Mrs. Wilson adjusted herself in the hospital bed and took her son's hand. "I'm angry," she said firmly. "But I'm also hopeful. Maybe this needed to happen. Maybe this is how we finally get the changes we've been pushing for all these years." Local news stations were already digging into Morrison's history. Anonymous sources within the department leaked information about previous complaints, all swept under the rug, all forgotten until now. Each new revelation added fuel to the growing demands for reform. The mayor called an emergency press conference, standing behind a podium with sweat beading on his forehead. "What happened today is unacceptable," he declared, cameras flashing. "We are launching a full investigation into not only this incident, but all previous complaints against Officer Morrison and our department's handling of those complaints." Social media couldn't get enough of the story. Video clips of the assault were being shared millions of times, often paired with old photos of Mrs. Wilson in her classroom, surrounded by smiling students. The contrast was striking. A woman who had dedicated her life to teaching children about respect and dignity being treated with neither. As night fell, the crowd outside the police station had grown to fill several blocks. People brought candles, creating a peaceful vigil. Stories about Mrs. Wilson circulated through the crowd, how she'd stayed late to help struggling students, how she'd bought school supplies for kids who couldn't afford them, how she'd been a pillar of the community for decades. Inside the station, Morrison watched the news coverage on a small TV. Each new report hit him like a physical blow. He saw interviews with former students, with parents, with community leaders, all talking about Mrs. Wilson's impact on their lives. The weight of what he'd done grew heavier with each passing hour. The police union, usually quick to defend officers, released an unusually stern statement. "The actions we witnessed today go against everything we stand for. We cannot and will not defend behavior that brings shame to our profession and harm to our community." By midnight, the story had gone national. Major networks picked it up, focusing not just on the assault, but on Mrs. Wilson's response and the community's reaction. Social media buzzed with discussions about police reform, about racial bias, about the treatment of elderly citizens. But unlike many similar incidents that sparked anger and division, this one was different. Mrs. Wilson's dignity in the face of violence had touched something deeper in people's hearts. The first day was ending, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. As Mrs. Wilson finally drifted off to sleep in her hospital room, her son keeping vigil by her side, the city outside was still awake, still talking, still sharing, still demanding change. The videos kept playing, the stories kept spreading, and the movement for reform gained momentum with each passing hour. Officer Morrison sat alone in a holding cell, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed, all because of a few seconds of uncontrolled prejudice and rage. But even as he faced the consequences of his actions, something bigger was happening. A community was coming together, united in their respect for a teacher who had always taught her students to respond to hatred with dignity and to fight injustice with grace. The immediate aftermath of the incident would prove to be just the first tremor in what would become a seismic shift for the city's police department and the community it served. As the night deepened, no one could predict exactly what changes would come, but everyone knew that things would never be quite the same again. The internal affairs investigation began early the next morning, with investigators taking over a conference room at police headquarters. Files were spread across the large table, years of complaint reports, incident documentation, and personnel records. The team worked methodically, piecing together a troubling pattern that should have been noticed years ago. "Look at this," one investigator said, holding up a file from 3 years back. A complaint about excessive force during a traffic stop. Dismissed without investigation, she added it to a growing pile of similar incidents. The lead investigator, a seasoned veteran with graying hair, rubbed his temples as he reviewed Morrison's body camera footage from the incident with Mrs. Wilson. The unedited video was even worse than the viral clips circulating online. It showed clearly how Morrison had escalated the situation from the moment he stepped out of his car. "Pull his training records," he ordered. "All of them. I want to know every instructor he's had, every evaluation he's received, every warning sign we missed." Down the hall, the police chief was dealing with his own crisis. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, city officials, community leaders, all demanding answers. On his computer screen, email after email poured in from officers within his own department, many expressing shame and anger over Morrison's actions. The chief's secretary knocked on his door. "Sir, the FBI just called. They're opening their own investigation into potential civil rights violations." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mrs. Wilson was being discharged. As she walked slowly toward her son's car, supported by a nurse, reporters called out questions. She paused, despite her son's gentle urging to keep moving. "I want to say something," she said quietly to her son. He nodded, knowing better than to argue with his mother's determined expression. Mrs. Wilson turned to face the cameras. The bruising on her face was now a deep purple, but her voice was clear and strong. "Yesterday, something terrible happened. But what matters now is what we do about it. I've spent my life teaching children to stand up for what's right. Now it's time for all of us to do just that." Back at police headquarters, the investigation was uncovering more disturbing details. Morrison's personnel file revealed a pattern of complaints that had been systematically downplayed or ignored. Training officers had noted concerns about his temperament, but their recommendations for additional supervision had been brushed aside. "Look at these psychological evaluations," one investigator said, spreading papers across the table. 3 different department psychologists recommended anger management training. None of these recommendations were ever followed up on. The investigation team also discovered that several high-ranking officers had actively protected Morrison over the years, burying complaints and pressuring witnesses to withdraw their statements. Each new revelation added another layer to what was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one officer's actions, but about a system that had enabled him. By afternoon, the FBI had arrived, setting up in a separate conference room. They brought with them boxes of records from other departments where similar incidents had occurred. The investigation was expanding beyond Morrison to examine the entire department's handling of misconduct complaints. "We need to talk to every officer who worked with him," the FBI lead agent announced. "Every supervisor, every partner. Someone had to see this coming." In another part of the city, Mrs. Wilson sat in her living room, surrounded by flowers and cards from former students and community members. She picked up one card, reading the message inside. "You taught me to be brave and stand up for what's right. Now it's our turn to stand up for you." Her son worked on his laptop nearby, reviewing case files and precedents. As district attorney, he had to recuse himself from directly prosecuting Morrison, but he was determined to ensure the investigation was thorough and fair. "Mom," he said, looking up from his work, they found 5 other incidents in the past 2 years alone. 5 times he used excessive force and nothing was done. Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly. "Then maybe this needed to happen," she said. "Sometimes it takes something dramatic to open people's eyes." The investigation team worked late into the night, their conference room lit by fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on the walls. They had interviewed dozens of officers, each conversation revealing new details about how warning signs had been ignored and complaints had vanished into bureaucratic black holes. One young officer, relatively new to the force, finally broke down during his interview. "Everyone knew," he admitted, his voice shaking. "We all knew he was dangerous, but nobody wanted to be the one to speak up. Nobody wanted to be labeled a troublemaker." As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Morrison's actions weren't just an isolated incident of rage, but the inevitable result of a system that had failed at multiple levels. Training had been inadequate, supervision had been lax, and accountability had been nearly non-existent. The FBI team discovered that Morrison had attended a de-escalation training course just 2 months earlier. The instructor's notes indicated that he had shown concerning behavior during role-play scenarios, but no follow-up action had been taken. Late that night, as the investigation team prepared to wrap up for the day, they received an anonymous email from within the department. Attached were dozens of internal messages showing how complaints against Morrison had been systematically buried. The corruption went higher than anyone had initially suspected. The lead investigator sat back in his chair, staring at the evidence spread across the table. "This isn't just about one bad officer anymore," he said to his team. "This is about fixing a broken system." Outside, the city was still buzzing with activity. Community meetings were being organized, reform proposals were being drafted, and people were sharing their own stories of encounters with police. Mrs. Wilson's assault had become a catalyst for change, forcing the department to confront issues it had ignored for far too long. The investigation would continue for weeks, but already it was clear that the findings would lead to major changes in how the department operated. Every new piece of evidence, every interview, every uncovered document pointed to the need for fundamental reform. As the third day drew to a close, the investigation had only scratched the surface, but one thing was certain. The truth was finally coming to light, and there would be no going back to business as usual. The department would have to change, or the community's trust would be lost forever. The community response grew stronger with each passing day. On a warm Saturday morning, thousands gathered in City Park for what was being called a Unity Rally for Change. The crowd was diverse, young and old, people from all walks of life, united in their demand for police reform and accountability. Mrs. Wilson sat on the stage in a comfortable chair, her bruises now fading to yellowish green. Despite her family's concerns, she had insisted on attending. "Change doesn't happen from the sidelines," she told them. Her presence added weight to the gathering, a living reminder of why they were all there. "Look at this crowd," a community organizer said, scanning the sea of faces. "When I was in Mrs. Wilson's class 20 years ago, she taught us about civic responsibility. She always said, when something's wrong, you don't just complain, you work to fix it." The park had been transformed into a space for dialogue and action. Information booths lined the paths, staffed by civil rights organizations, legal aid groups, and police reform advocates. People shared stories, signed petitions, and learned about proposed changes to police training and oversight. A retired police officer who had served for 30 years took the microphone. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke. "I've been silent too long," he admitted. "We all knew there were problems, but we looked the other way. What happened to Mrs. Wilson? That's on all of us who saw the warning signs and did nothing." The crowd listened intently as speakers shared personal experiences and outlined specific demands for change. They weren't calling for revenge or punishment, they wanted real, lasting reform. Signs in the crowd read "Training before badges" and "Community-first policing." Local businesses had joined the effort. The owner of a popular restaurant near the police station announced he would offer free lunch to officers who completed additional de-escalation training. Other business owners pledged to support community policing initiatives and youth outreach programs. At one booth, a group of high school students demonstrated a smartphone app they developed. It allowed users to safely record and document interactions with police officers, automatically uploading footage to secure servers. They'd named it Wilson Watch in honor of their former teacher. Mrs. Wilson's former colleagues from Lincoln Elementary had organized a letter-writing campaign. Hundreds of teachers shared stories about her influence on their teaching methods and her dedication to teaching children about respect, dignity, and standing up for what's right. "Remember when she started the conflict resolution program? One teacher asked another. She believed every child could learn to solve problems without violence. Maybe that's what our police department needs, to learn what Mrs. Wilson has been teaching kids for decades. The media coverage was extensive, but different from the usual sensational reporting. Reporters focused on the constructive aspects of the community response, the specific proposals for reform, the collaboration between different groups, and the emphasis on positive change rather than punishment. A local church had set up a prayer tent where people of different faiths gathered to pray for healing and unity. Next to it, a group of artists worked on a mural depicting Mrs. Wilson in her classroom, surrounded by the words, "Teach peace" and "Learn justice." "This isn't just about one incident anymore," said a community leader, addressing the crowd. "This is about building the kind of police department we deserve, one that protects and serves everyone equally, one that treats every citizen with dignity and respect." The police chief attended the rally, not to speak but to listen. He sat in the back, taking notes as speaker after speaker shared their experiences and ideas for reform. Several officers joined him, out of uniform, ready to be part of the solution. A group of law students had set up a booth offering free legal advice and information about citizens' rights. They'd created simple, easy-to-understand pamphlets explaining what to do during police encounters and how to file complaints if necessary. As the afternoon wore on, the rally transformed into a community festival. Food trucks arrived, local bands performed, and children played games organized by youth groups. The atmosphere was one of hope and determination rather than anger and division. Mrs. Wilson's son watched from beside her chair as people lined up to shake her hand and share their stories. Each person had a memory of how she'd touched their lives, how she'd taught them to stand up for what's right while maintaining their dignity. "Your mother," a community elder said to him, "she's showing us how to turn pain into progress. She's still teaching even now." The rally concluded with a candlelight vigil as the sun set. Thousands of lights flickered in the gathering darkness as people sang songs of hope and unity. Mrs. Wilson, despite her fatigue, stood with support from her family, her face illuminated by candlelight. "Look around," she said softly to those nearest her. "This is what community looks like. This is how change begins." As people began to disperse, plans were already being made for future actions: town hall meetings, training workshops, youth police dialogue sessions. The momentum for change was building, and everyone knew this was just the beginning. The day's events made headlines across the country, not for conflict or controversy, but as an example of how a community could come together to demand change while maintaining dignity and respect. Mrs. Wilson's influence was evident in every aspect. Her lifelong teachings about peaceful resolution and standing up for justice were being put into practice on a scale she never imagined. The community response had transformed a moment of violence into a movement for change, proving that even the darkest incidents could lead to positive transformation when people came together with purpose and hope. The police department's reckoning began on a Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident. The chief sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by his command staff. The atmosphere was tense as he opened a thick folder labeled Morrison Investigation Findings. "What I'm about to share will be difficult to hear," he began, his voice heavy. "But we can't hide from the truth anymore." He started reading from the report, detailing years of overlooked warnings, buried complaints, and systematic failures. Outside his office, the department was already changing. Officers arrived for their shifts to find new training schedules posted. The usual morning briefing had been replaced with a mandatory 4-hour session on de-escalation techniques and bias recognition. In the break room, officers gathered around a coffee machine, talking in low voices about the changes. "Did you get? They're bringing in outside trainers," one said, "international experts in community policing." The chief continued his meeting upstairs. "Starting today, every complaint gets investigated, no exceptions. Every use of force gets reviewed, no cover-ups." He looked each commander in the eye. "And if anyone has a problem with that, there's the door." By noon, 3 high-ranking officers had resigned. Their departure sent shockwaves through the department. These were men who had built their careers on maintaining the status quo, on protecting their own at any cost. The internal affairs team had set up a special hotline for officers to report past incidents of misconduct. By the end of the first day, they had received dozens of calls. Officers who had stayed silent for years were finally speaking up, unburdening themselves of the weight of their silence. A young officer sat in the Internal Affairs office, his hands shaking as he described witnessing Morrison's previous acts of aggression. "I wanted to report it," he said, wiping his eyes. "But everyone told me to keep quiet if I wanted to keep my badge." The chief called a department-wide meeting in the main briefing room. Officers filled every seat, lined the walls, spilled out into the hallway. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the podium. "Look around," he said. "Every person in this room took an oath to protect and serve. We've failed that oath. Not just Morrison, all of us. We saw the problems and we looked away. That ends today." He outlined the changes that would take effect immediately. Every officer would be required to requalify, not just in firearms and tactics, but in cultural sensitivity and community relations. Body cameras would be mandatory, with strict penalties for turning them off. The police union representatives sat in stony silence as the chief announced the formation of a civilian oversight board with real power, the authority to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and even terminate officers. "This isn't a punishment," the chief emphasized. "This is an opportunity to become the department this community deserves. The department we should have been all along." In the evidence room, technicians began the massive task of reviewing years of body camera footage, looking for patterns of misconduct that had gone unreported. They worked in shifts, documenting every instance of excessive force, every racist comment, every abuse of power. The psychological screening process for new recruits was completely overhauled. The department brought in experts to develop new criteria for evaluating candidates' temperament and bias. The old warrior mentality was out. They were looking for guardians now. By late afternoon, news vans were parked outside as the chief held a press conference announcing the resignations and the new accountability measures. He didn't try to spin it or minimize the department's failures. "We lost our way," he admitted to the cameras. "Mrs. Wilson's assault wasn't just one bad officer having a bad day. It was the result of a culture that valued silence over justice, loyalty over truth." Inside the department, officers processed the changes in different ways. Some were angry, clinging to the old ways. Others felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted. And some were inspired, seeing a chance to become the kind of officers they'd always wanted to be. Training rooms were converted into discussion spaces where officers could share their concerns and experiences. Counselors were brought in to help process the emotional impact of the changes. The department was learning that real strength came from acknowledging weakness and working to improve. The chief ended the day in his office, looking at a framed photo of his first day on the force 30 years ago. "We've got a long way to go," he said to his deputy, "but at least we're finally heading in the right direction." As night fell, the department felt different. The usual bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. Officers heading out for the night shift carried with them not just their badges and guns, but a new understanding of their responsibility to the community. Morrison's empty locker was cleaned out, its contents boxed up as evidence. But his presence lingered as a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked, when good people stay silent in the face of wrong. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no going back. The department that had protected Morrison and others like him was being dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by something new, something better, something worthy of the community's trust. The changes weren't easy, and they weren't always welcome. But they were necessary. As one veteran officer said, while turning in his old badge for a new one, "Sometimes you have to tear everything down to build it back up right." In the months that followed, the promised changes began taking shape. The old police headquarters lobby, once cold and intimidating, was transformed into a welcoming community space. The bulletproof glass was replaced with clear panels, and the walls now displayed artwork from local schools, including several pieces from Mrs. Wilson's former students. "It's more than just decorations," the chief explained to a group of visiting officials from other cities. "It's about changing how we think about our relationship with the community." He pointed to a new help desk staffed by civilian volunteers who helped visitors navigate the system. The biggest change was happening in the training center. The old shooting range had been partially converted into a simulation facility where officers practiced de-escalation techniques in realistic scenarios. The sounds of gunfire were replaced by the voices of officers learning to talk down tense situations. Remember, the new training instructor called out to a group of officers, "Your most powerful weapon isn't your gun, it's your ability to listen and communicate." The officers nodded, taking notes as they watched their colleagues role-play different scenarios. In another room, community members sat with officers in listening circles, sharing their experiences and perspectives. These sessions, once met with eye rolls and resistance, had become a vital part of police training. Officers learned firsthand how their actions affected people's lives. The Civilian Review Board, now fully operational, had set up office in a renovated space down the hall from Internal Affairs. They worked independently but cooperatively with the department, ensuring transparency and accountability in every investigation. Last week, we reviewed 28 complaints, the board chairperson reported at a public meeting. Each one was thoroughly investigated. No exceptions, no cover-ups. The change in numbers was striking, not because there were more complaints, but because every complaint was now being properly addressed. The department's new mental health unit was making a difference too. Instead of sending armed officers to every call, trained crisis counselors responded to situations involving mental health issues. The results were impressive: fewer confrontations, better outcomes, and stronger community trust. Outside the station, community policing took on new meaning. Officers were assigned to specific neighborhoods not just to patrol, but to become part of the community. They attended local events, knew residents by name, and worked with community leaders to solve problems before they became crimes. One officer, who had initially resisted the changes, shared his experience at a training session. "Last week, I helped organize a basketball game between police and local kids," he said. "We lost badly, but we won something more important: their trust." The department's hiring practices had changed dramatically. Recruiters now looked beyond physical fitness and tactical skills, emphasizing emotional intelligence and community connection. Background checks included social media history and extensive interviews with neighbors and former colleagues. "We're not just hiring officers anymore," the recruitment director explained. "We're hiring community guardians." There's a difference. Mrs. Wilson's influence continued to shape the reforms. The department had incorporated elements of her teaching philosophy into their training program. Officers learned about cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. The changes weren't confined to the local department. Other cities sent observers to study the reforms, taking notes and asking questions. The model of change that emerged from the Morrison incident was becoming a blueprint for departments across the country. Technology played a crucial role in the transformation. Every officer now wore a body camera that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. The footage was automatically uploaded to secure servers monitored by both Internal Affairs and the Civilian Review Board. The department's website was redesigned to make it easier for citizens to file complaints or commendations. An online dashboard showed real-time statistics about police interactions, use of force incidents, and the status of investigations. In the break room, the old thin blue line flags had been replaced with community partnership posters. Officers still had their brotherhood, but it was no longer at odds with their commitment to the community they served. The budget reflected the new priorities. Money once spent on military-style equipment was redirected to training, community programs, and mental health resources. The department even funded scholarships for local youth interested in careers in law enforcement or community service. Regular town hall meetings became a fixture where officers and community members could discuss concerns and share ideas. These weren't just for show. Real policy changes came from these discussions. The transformation wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to overcome. But the culture of silence and protection that had allowed Morrison to abuse his power was gone. In its place was a new culture of accountability, transparency, and community partnership. As one veteran officer put it during a training session, "We're not just changing policies and procedures, we're changing hearts and minds." And that's the change that lasts. The systemic changes that grew from Mrs. Wilson's assault had become a model for police reform nationwide. What started as a tragedy had evolved into a blueprint for transforming law enforcement from the inside out. By the end of the first year, the department looked and felt different. The walls between police and community had begun to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding and cooperation. The change that everyone had hoped for was finally becoming reality. 1 year after the incident, Mrs. Wilson stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber. The room was packed with community members, police officers, city officials, and media. Her face showed no traces of the bruises that had once shocked the nation, but the memory of that day had left a different kind of mark, one that had changed an entire city. "When I was teaching," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I always told my students that every challenge is an opportunity for growth. What happened to me was terrible, but look at what grew from it." She gestured to the crowd, where former students sat alongside police officers, all united in the cause of reform. The chief stepped up next, presenting a thick report documenting the department's transformation. "Our arrest rates are down 40%, he announced. Complaints against officers have dropped by 60%. But the most important number is this: community trust in law enforcement has doubled." In the year since Morrison's assault on Mrs. Wilson, the changes had taken root and flourished. The department had become a national model for police reform, with delegations from other cities regularly visiting to study their methods. The training center, once focused mainly on weapons and tactics, now had a different atmosphere. New officers learned about community engagement alongside their traditional skills. Veterans went through regular refresher courses in de-escalation and cultural awareness. Yesterday, I watched 2 officers handle a situation that, a year ago, might have ended badly, a community observer shared. Instead of rushing in with force, they took time to listen, to understand. They solved the problem without anyone getting hurt. The Civilian Review Board had proven its worth. Every complaint was investigated thoroughly, and their findings were made public. Officers who showed exemplary conduct were recognized, while those who fell short faced real consequences. Morrison's trial had concluded months earlier. His conviction sent a clear message: the badge was no longer a shield against accountability. But more important than his punishment was the change his actions had inadvertently sparked. Mrs. Wilson had become a regular consultant for the police department's training program. Her decades of experience in teaching conflict resolution and community building proved invaluable in reshaping how officers approached their work. The other day, one officer shared during a training session, "I caught myself before reacting to a tense situation. I remembered Mrs. Wilson's words about treating everyone with dignity, even when they're at their worst. It completely changed how I handled things." The community policing program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. Officers were deeply involved in neighborhood activities, coaching youth sports teams, mentoring students, and participating in community events. The us versus them mentality was fading. Local schools had incorporated elements of the police reform story into their civics curriculum. Students learned about the importance of civic engagement and peaceful advocacy for change. Mrs. Wilson's experience became a case study in how communities could transform tragedy into progress. The department's mental health unit had grown into a full-fledged crisis response team. Mental health professionals now responded to many calls that once would have been handled by armed officers. The results were clear: fewer confrontations, better outcomes, and lives saved. Technology played a crucial role in maintaining transparency. Body camera footage was regularly reviewed not just for misconduct, but as a training tool to highlight examples of good policing. The department's public database of police interactions had become a model for other cities. The changes weren't limited to the police department. The city had implemented new programs to address root causes of crime: poverty, mental health, addiction, and lack of opportunity. Officers worked alongside social workers and community organizations in a comprehensive approach to public safety. Mrs. Wilson's son, the district attorney, had used his position to support the reforms. His office worked closely with the police department to ensure that justice was served fairly and equally. The old adversarial relationship between prosecutors and defense attorneys had evolved into a more collaborative approach focused on actual justice rather than just convictions. As Mrs. Wilson concluded her speech at City Hall, she shared a final thought: "1 year ago, I was a victim of police brutality. Today, I'm part of the solution." That's not just my legacy, it's our community's legacy. We proved that change is possible when people come together with purpose and hope. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just applause for Mrs. Wilson. It was celebration of what they had accomplished together, a real lasting transformation in how law enforcement served their community. The legacy of change continued to grow. Other cities began adopting similar reforms, creating a ripple effect of positive change across the country. What started as one officer's moment of brutality had become a catalyst for nationwide police reform. As people filed out of City Hall that evening, there was a sense that they had witnessed something remarkable, not just the anniversary of a tragic event, but the celebration of how a community had come together to turn that tragedy into triumph. The story of Mrs. Wilson and the changes she inspired would be told for years to come, not as a tale of violence and victimization, but as an example of how dignity, determination, and community action could transform even the darkest moments into opportunities for positive change.